The snow had been falling since morning, soft and steady, covering the small town in a quiet white blanket. Christmas lights flickered in every window, and the air smelled of pine, cinnamon, and something warm baking in ovens across the neighborhood. But inside a small, worn house at the end of Maple Street, the silence felt heavier than the snow. Arthur Bennett sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Excellent. His hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around the cup, more out of habit than need. The house was quiet to quiet. No laughter, no music. Dust, the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. It had been 5 years since his wife, Margaret, passed away. And every Christmas since then felt a little colder than the last. Arthur glanced at the calendar hanging near the fridge. December 25th, Christmas Day. He sighed. "I guess it's just you and me again," he muttered, speaking to the empty room. He stood slowly and walked to the living room, where a small artificial Christmas tree stood in the corner. It was decorated simply, just a few ornaments and a single strand of lights. Margaret had loved decorating the tree, turning it into something magical. After she was gone, Arthur never found the heart to do more than the bare minimum. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photo of the two of them, taken decades ago. They were young then, smiling, holding hands in front of a real Christmas tree, their eyes full of hope. "I miss you," Arthur whispered, outside. Children laughed as they ran past his house, their voices bright and full of excitement. Arthur watched them through the window, a faint smile touching his lips before fading just as quickly. His children lived far away now. Busy lives, busy schedules. They had called, of course, promised to visit soon. But Christmas, once again, would be spent alone. Arthur pulled on his old coat and scarf. He had decided earlier that morning to take a walk, if only to feel less trapped inside his thoughts. The cold air bit at his face as he stepped outside, but it felt honest real. As he walked through the snow-covered streets, he passed houses filled with warmth and light. Families gathered around tables, children opening presents. Laughter spilling out through cracked doors. He wasn't bitter, not really, just tired. At the corner of Maple Street stood a small bakery, its windows fogged up from the warmth. Inside, a handwritten sign hung on the door, "Open until noon, Merry Christmas." Arthur hesitated, then pushed the door open. The warmth hit him instantly, along with the smell of fresh bread and sugar. Behind the counter stood a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, tying a ribbon around a box of pastries. "Merry Christmas," she said brightly. Looking up, Arthur nodded. "Merry Christmas." He ordered a small loaf of bread and a single cinnamon roll, something sweet for the day. As he reached into his pocket, the woman gently waved her hand. "It's on the house," she said. Arthur frowned. "Oh no, I couldn't," she smiled. "Please, it's Christmas." For a moment, Arthur didn't trust his voice. He simply nodded and accepted the box. "Thank you," he said quietly as he turned to leave. The woman added, "You know, the community center is hosting a Christmas dinner tonight. Anyone's welcome." Arthur paused, his hand on the door. "Anyone?" he asked. "Anyone," she repeated. The walk home felt different, lighter that evening. As the sky darkened and the snow continued to fall, Arthur stood in his hallway, coat in hand, debating with himself. He hadn't planned to go. He wasn't sure he belonged somewhere like that anymore. But something nudged him forward. The community center was alive with warmth. Lights glowed softly, and music played. Somewhere in the background, the moment Arthur stepped inside, he was greeted by the hum of voices, laughter, and clinking dishes. A volunteer spotted him and smiled. "Welcome. Come on in." Arthur found himself seated at a long table, surrounded by people of all ages, families, singles, elderly couples, strangers, all brought together by the same evening. A plate of food was placed in front of him, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and cranberry sauce. Simple, perfect. As he ate, A small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hi!" Arthur looked up to see a young boy standing beside him, holding a paper snowflake. "My name's Liam," the boy said. "We're giving these to everyone." Arthur took the snowflake, carefully made, a little uneven around the edges. "It's beautiful," Arthur said. Liam beamed. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," Arthur replied, his throat tight. Later that night, as people began to leave, Arthur found himself helping stack chairs and wipe tables. It felt good to be useful again. When he finally stepped back into the cold night air, snowflakes still in his pocket, the town could look different. Softer, kinder, back at home. Arthur turned on the lights of his small tree and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. He placed the paper snowflake on the mantel, right beside the photo of Margaret. "You would have liked tonight," he said softly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and gentle. And for the first time in a long while, Arthur didn't feel alone. Done next morning, Arthur woke to the sound of church bells echoing faintly through the town. He lay still for a moment, listening, half expecting the familiar heaviness to settle in his chest. But it didn't. Instead, there was a quiet calm, like the air after fresh snowfall. He sat up slowly and glanced toward the mantel. The paper snowflake was still there. Arthur smiled. He made himself breakfast toast and eggs this time and turned on the radio. Soft Christmas. Good music filled the kitchen, and for once, he didn't feel the urge to turn it off. Keith found himself humming along, a tune Margaret used to love. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Arthur froze. No one ever knocked anymore. He stood, heart beating a little faster than usual, and opened the door to find the young woman, Bryn, from the bakery standing on his porch. She held a small box tied with red string. "I hope this isn't strange," she said quickly, smiling. "You left your scarf at the bakery yesterday." Arthur blinked. He looked down. She was right. "I must be losing my head," he chuckled. She handed him the box. "And these were extra. I didn't want them to go to waste." Inside were 2 cinnamon rolls, still warm. "That's very kind of you," Arthur said. "I'm Emma," she added. "I live a few streets over." "Arthur," he replied. "Could you like to come in? It's cold out here." Emma hesitated just a second, then nodded. They sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea. The conversation came easily about the town, the bakery, the snow, the way Christmas felt different for everyone. "I moved here last year," Emma said. "I didn't know anyone at first. Christmas was hard." Arthur nodded slowly. "It still is. But last night helped." Emma smiled. That's why I love that dinner. It reminds people they're not invisible." The word lingered. Invisible. After Emma left, Arthur stayed at the table for a long time, thinking about how many years he had felt exactly that. Invisible? That evening, Arthur pulled out an old box from the closet. Inside were ornaments Margaret had carefully wrapped years ago. He hadn't touched them since she passed. He unwrapped one, slowly a glass angel with chipped wings. "I think it's time," he said softly. He spent the next hour decorating the tree properly for the first time in years. When he finished, the room glowed warmly, reflections dancing on the walls. Arthur sat back, breathing deeply. The following days passed gently. Arthur returned to the community center, first to drop off a donation, then to help organize shelves, and eventually just to talk. He learned names, heard stories, shared his own. One afternoon, Liam, the boy from Christmas dinner, ran up to him. "Arthur, guess what?" "What?" Arthur asked. "We're making cards for people who live alone. My mom says you can help." Arthur laughed. "I'd like that." He did more than help. He stayed. As weeks turned into months, Maple Street no longer felt so quiet. Emma stopped by often, sometimes with pastries, sometimes just to talk. Arthur began baking again, something he hadn't done since Margaret's last Christmas. One evening in early spring, Arthur stood outside, watching the snow melt into soft puddles. Emma joined him. "You know," she said, You changed too. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Did I? She nodded. You're lighter. Like you remembered something important. Arthur thought for a moment. I remembered that life doesn't stop just because one chapter ends. Emma smiled. That? December? A year later, Arthur's house glowed brighter than any on Maple Street. Lights wrapped the porch. A wreath hung proudly on the door. Inside, the tree was tall and full. The community dinner had grown, too. More people, more laughter. Arthur stood at the entrance, welcoming guests. When Liam ran up and hugged him, Arthur didn't hesitate. He hugged him back. Later that night, as snow began to fall once more, Arthur returned home. Cootie placed a new ornament on the tree, one shaped like a snowflake. He looked at Margaret's photo and smiled. Turns out, he said gently, Christmas didn't leave me after all. Outside, the town glowed under fresh snow, and inside a small house at the end of Maple Street, warmth lived again. Spring arrived quietly in Willowmere, almost shy in the way it pushed winter aside. Snow melted into thin silver streams along the sidewalks, and buds appeared on trees that Arthur had once thought long dead. Each morning, sunlight crept a little farther into his kitchen, warming the table where he now drank his coffee. Arthur had developed a routine again. He woke early, opened the curtains, and let the light in. Some days he walked to the bakery. Other days, he stopped by the community center, where he'd become something of a familiar face. People greeted him by name now, asked how he was, asked for his help. It surprised him how much that mattered. One afternoon, as Arthur was shelving donated books, a woman approached him hesitantly. She looked tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying too much alone. They said you'd understand, she said. Arthur paused. Understand what? Being alone. She replied softly. He nodded and pulled out a chair. They talked for nearly an hour. Arthur didn't give advice. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply could listen. When she left, she squeezed his hand and said, "Thank you for seeing me." That word again, seeing. That evening, Arthur walked home under a sky painted pink and gold. He realized something. Denny hadn't thought about the emptiness in weeks, not because it was gone, but because it no longer defined him. Could Margaret still lived in his memories, in the way he folded towels, in the songs he hummed, while washing dishes, in a way he still reached for the second mug before catching himself. But now, those memories felt warm instead of sharp. Summer brought its own kind of joy. Children played in the street again. Neighbors sat on porches. Emma's bakery became busier than ever, and Arthur often helped carry boxers or sweep floors in exchange for pastries he pretended he didn't need. One afternoon, Emma handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" Arthur asked. "An invitation," she said. "The community center is starting a storytelling night. People, share memories. I thought you might like to speak." Arthur stared at the envelope. "I'm not sure," he said. "I've never been good at talking in front of people." Emma smiled gently. "You're already good at it. Chew, just don't realize it." The night of the event, Arthur sat in the back row, heart pounding like he was a schoolboy. Could again. People shared stories about childhood, about loss, about hope. Could. Laughter mixed with tears. When Arthur's name was called, he hesitated. Then he stood. "I didn't plan to say much," he began, voice steady but quiet. "I spent years thinking my life had gotten smaller, quieter. I thought that meant it was over." The room was still. "But I learned something," he continued. "Life doesn't end when you lose someone. Good changes, and sometimes it waits for you to notice that it's still here." When he sat down, the applause wasn't loud, but it was real. Autumn arrived, bringing crisp air and falling leaves. Arthur began volunteering regularly, helping organize food drives, visiting seniors who couldn't leave their homes. Some days were heavy. Some days were joyful. All of them mattered. And then, almost without warning, Christmas returned. The lights went up earlier this year. Could music played sooner? Arthur found himself planning ahead, buying extra ornaments, helping Emma decorate the bakery window, baking cookies for neighbors. Done. Christmas Eve, the community center was fuller than ever. Arthur stood near the door, greeting people as snow fell softly outside. He spotted familiar faces, new ones too, and then he saw something that made his chest tighten. A man stood hesitantly at the entrance, coat too thin, eyes unsure. Arthur walked over. "Merry Christmas," he said. The man nodded. "I wasn't sure if I should come in." Arthur smiled and gestured inside. "That's exactly when you should." Later that night, Arthur returned home, snow crunching beneath his boots. His house glowed warmly, lights reflecting in the window. Inside, the tree sparkled, full and alive. Arthur placed one last ornament on a small wooden heart someone had carved for him at the center. He stood back and took it all in. Once, Christmas had reminded him of what he lost. Now, it reminded him of what he found. Arthur turned off the lights, sat by the window, and watched the snow fall. And for the second year in a row, he felt something he thought was gone forever. Belonging. The year turned quietly after that. No fireworks, no grand announcements, just mornings that arrived on time and evenings that felt earned. Arthur noticed the change most in the smallest moments. The way he no longer rushed through breakfast. The way silence no longer felt like an enemy, but a companion that sat beside him, without asking anything in return. He still missed Margaret. He always would, but the ache had softened into something kinder, something that reminded him of love, not loss. Winter lingered longer that year. Snow clung to the rooftops, and the sea beyond Willowmere wore a steelgray.com. Arthur continued his walks, slower now, hands tucked into his coat, breath visible in the cold air. People waved from across the street. Childrick shouted his name. Someone always stopped him to talk. Key belonged here. One afternoon, Arthur received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Careful, it was from a young man he had spoken to on Christmas Eve, the one who had stood uncertain at the door. The letter was short. "I didn't think anyone would notice me that night. But you did. I just wanted you to know that I'm doing better now. Thank you for opening the door." Arthur folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box beside Margaret's old scarf. He sat for a long time after that, staring out the window, understanding something he hadn't before. Goodness, echoes, spring returned again, and with it, new faces, new stories. Arthur helped plant flowers outside the community center. He laughed more icily now. He even caught himself humming again songs Margaret used to love. One morning, Emma handed him a cup of tea and said, "You know, you've changed this place." Arthur shook his head. "No," he replied gently. "This place changed me." That summer, Willowmere held its first festival in years. Strings of lights crisscrossed the square. Music drifted through the air. Arthur stood among the crowd, watching children dance, neighbors talk, strangers become familiar. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was watching life happen. He was inside it. As evening fell, Arthur stepped away toward the edge of town, where the sea met the sky. The sun dipped low, painting the water gold. He thought of all the years he believed were behind him. All the days he assumed were finished. He smiled softly. Life, he realized, doesn't measure itself in years, but in moments of connection. In doors held, in stories shared, in the courage to stay when it would be easier to disappear. Arthur turned back toward the lights of Willowmere, toward voices calling his name. And as he walked home, steady and unafraid, he knew something with quiet certainty. His life hadn't ended when everything went silent. It had simply been waiting for him to listen. Time kept moving, the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission. Arthur stopped counting days somewhere along the way. He no longer measured life by anniversaries or empty spaces on a calendar. Instead, he measured it by mornings filled with purpose and evenings that ended without regret. There were still hard days. Some mornings, He woke expecting to hear Margaret moving around the kitchen. Some nights could. The quiet pressed a little too close. On those days, Arthur didn't fight the feeling. He sat with it, let it pass through him like a tide instead of a storm. That, too, was something he had learned. One autumn afternoon, a group of children knocked on his door. They stood awkwardly on the porch leaves, crunching beneath their shoes. "We're doing interviews." One of them said, "For school? What's about people in town?" Arthur raised an eyebrow, amused. "People like me." They nodded eagerly. They asked him questions about Willowmere Pa, about change, about what life was like back then. At the end, one small girl asked something different. "What's the most important thing you've learned?" Arthur thought for a long moment. "That it's never too late to begin again," he said finally, "and that being needed is a gift, not burden." The children wrote it down carefully, as if it mattered. Because it did. Winter returned once more. Softer this time, less heavy. The town prepared early again. Lights peering in windows, wreaths on doors. Arthur helped string decorations at the community center. Hands steady, heart full. On Christmas Eve, the room filled with no old faces. New ones? People carrying their own quiet, good struggles. Arthur stood near the door, as always, greeting each person like they belonged there. Because they did. Later that night, after the last guest left and the lights dimmed, Arthur stepped outside. Snow drifted down slowly, peacefully. The town glowed behind him. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I'm okay." Not because everything was perfect, but because it was real, and it was his. Arthur turned toward home, footsteps steady, breath calm. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end, begin. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The years that followed didn't rush past him. They unfolded. Arthur grew older, yes, but not smaller. His hair turned whiter, his steps slower, yet his presence carried more weight than ever. People sought him out, without quite knowing why. He had become the kind of person others felt safe around. The kind who made space without asking for anything back. Some evenings, Arthur sat on the bench near the harbor. Watching the tide roll in and out, he noticed how nothing ever truly stayed still, how even the sea needed to move, to remain whole. That thought stayed with him. Life, he realized, wasn't about holding on. It was about allowing. One spring morning, Emma sat beside him, quieter than usual. "I got an offer," she said. "Got a bigger bakery in the city." Arthur nodded, already knowing what she was really asking. "I'm scared to leave," she admitted. "This place gave me everything." Arthur smiled gently. "And now it's giving you wings." She laughed softly, eyes misty. "You always know what to say." "No," Arthur replied. "You already know." "Could I just remind you?" When Emma left months later, the town threw her a farewell that filled the square with laughter and tears. Arthur stood at the edge, clapping slowly, heart full. Loss no longer frightened him. It simply reminded him that love had passed through, and love, once given, never truly leaves. Winters came and went. Miss Lights returned year after year. Arthur still opened the doors. The community center on Christmas Eve, though now others helped him. Some traditions grew bigger, some stayed small. All of them mattered. One night, long after the town had settled into sleep, Arthur sat by his window, wrapped in a blanket Margaret once knitted. The sea whispered in the distance. His breathing was calm. He wasn't afraid. He thought of all the versions of himself he had been: the man who lost, man who hid, the man who almost disappeared, and he felt gratitude for every step that had led him here. Arthur closed his eyes, and when morning came, the town woke gently, just as it always had. Neighbors noticed the quiet. Someone knocked on Arthur's door, then another. They gathered outside, standing together in the soft light. Inside, Arthur rested peacefully, a faint smile still on his face. Because he had lived fully, because he had loved deeply, because he had found his way home, not to a place, but to people. And long after that morning, when stories were told about Willowmere, someone could say, "Dear, was a man here once, who reminded us how to stay." And in that remembering, Arthur never truly left. The town didn't rush to explain what it had lost. Willowmere rarely did. Instead, it had just tenderly, like a shoreline reshaping itself after a long tide. Arthur's bench by the harbor remained. No plaque at first, just flowers that appeared without anyone admitting they brought them. A scarf folded neatly on cold mornings. Fresh paint on the community center door. The hinges oiled the way Arthur used to do it. People began telling stories, not loudly, not all at once, but in kitchens, on walks, over cups of tea. Someone remembered how Arthur once stayed late just to listen. Someone else remembered how he opened a door when no one else did. A child remembered the way he knelt to speak at eye level, as if nothing in the world mattered. Or the storytelling night at the community center continued. It always would. But now, an empty chair was left near the back. No announcement, no explanation. Everyone knew spring came again, as it always does. Emma returned that year not to stay, but to visit. She stood in the square, breathing in the salt air, smiling through tears. She didn't wipe away. She brought pastries for the children and sat on Arthur's bench for a long time, saying nothing. "I did okay," she whispered finally. "Just like you said, the town grew. New families arrived. Old houses filled again. Children learned to ride bicycles. Where Arthur once walked slowly, hands behind his back, smiling at the noise of life. And something else happened, something quiet but powerful. People stayed. They stayed a little longer at conversations. They held doors open without checking the time. They noticed the ones standing alone. Arthur had never asked them to do that. He had simply shown them how. Years later, a young woman new to Willowmere, carrying her own invisible weight, stood hesitantly outside the community center on Christmas Eve. Snow fell softly. Light spilled through the windows. She almost turned away, but then the door opened. A man she didn't know smiled warmly and said, "Come in. You're just in time." And somewhere, if such things can be said, Arthur's presence lingered. Not as a memory frozen in time, but as a living current, moving gently through the town. Because some people don't leave behind names or monuments. They leave behind ways of being, and Willowmere remembered. Always. Winter eased in again, softer than before, as if it had learned something from the years that came before it. Willowmere had changed, but not in ways you could point to on a map. It wasn't bigger. It wasn't louder. It was simply kinder. The kind of place where people paused when they passed one another, where a question like, "How are you?" was asked with time to hear the answer. Arthur's bench by the harbor became a meeting place. Not officially. It just could happen. People sat there when they needed to think, when they needed to breathe, when they needed to remember that life could be gentle again. Children grew up hearing stories about a man they never met but somehow felt they knew. Teachers mentioned him in passing. Parents repeated his words without always remembering where they'd heard them first. "It's never too late to begin again." That sentence traveled far beyond Willowmere. Years later, a small wooden sign appeared near the community center. No ceremony, no speech, just a simple line carved into it. "This place is open." Nothing more was needed. On a quiet evening, long after the town lights flickered on, someone stood by the harbor, watching the sea breathe in and out. The air smelled of salt and pine. The sky stretched wide and forgiving. Life went on messy, beautiful, unfinished. And that was the point. Arthur's story didn't end the day he stopped walking through town. It continued every time. Someone chose to stay instead of leaving. To listen instead of turning away. To open a door when it would have been easier to walk past. Willowmere never tried to hold on to him. It simply carried him forward in gestures. In pauses, in warmth passed from one life to another, and somewhere between the sound of waves and the quiet hum of homes filled with light, the town understood something simple and lasting. Some people don't change the world by being loud. They change it by being there. The sea kept its rhythm. Morning after morning, waves reached the shore and pulled back again, leaving patterns no one toyed to preserve. Willowmere learned to live like that, present, unforced, accepting that nothing needed to last forever to matter. Bench by the harbor weathered slowly. Its wood faded, then was repaired, could repaired again. No one ever suggested replacing it. It had earned its place. On quiet afternoons, people still sat there alone. On busier days, they shared the space without asking. Sometimes there was laughter, sometimes silence. Both were welcome. The community center grew busier over the years. New programs, new faces. The door remained unlocked longer than most places would dare. And strangely enough, nothing bad ever came of that. Trust, it turned out, had a way of protecting itself. One winter evening, long after Arthur's name had stopped being spoken aloud as often, a young boy asked his grandmother why everyone in town was so patient. She smiled and said, "Because someone once taught us how." "Who?" the boy asked. She thought for a moment, then said, "Someone who understood that people don't need fixing. They just need space." That answer stayed with him. Years later, when he was grown and life felt heavier than he expected, he remembered Willowmere. He remembered the way people looked at each other there. The way doors opened. The way silence was allowed, and he stayed when he might have left. That was how it worked. Not miracles, not grand gestures, just choices made a little more gently. Again and again. The town never claimed to be special. Visitors sometimes said it felt different, though. Like a place that wasn't trying to impress anyone. Like a place that understood something essential. That life doesn't ask us to be extraordinary, only to be present. Only to notice, only to stay when it matters. And so Willowmere went on held together, not by history or buildings or traditions, but by a quiet agreement passed from one heart to another. When someone stands at the door, unsure, you open it, always. Years later, when people tried to explain Willowmere to outsiders, they struggled. There was no landmark that captured it, no single story that defined it. Nothing dramatic enough to fit neatly into words. And yet, anyone who stayed long enough felt it, the unspoken understanding that this town did not hurry you, did not demand more than you could give. Life continued in ordinary ways. Babies were born. Old friends drifted away. New ones arrived carrying suitcases and quiet hopes. Storms came and passed. Summers bloomed and faded. None of it was remarkable on its own. What was remarkable was how people treated one another in between. If someone missed a week of walks, someone checked in. If a light stayed off too long, a knock followed. Not out of suspicion, but care. Too, the community center walls filled with photographs over time. None of them labeled, just moments. Smiles. Shared meals, people sitting close without needing to explain why. Arthur appeared in none of the pictures, and yet he was everywhere. In the way meetings ended with time left for conversation, in the way disagreements softened before becoming wounds, in the way no one was ever rushed out the door when they weren't ready to leave. On one quiet Christmas Eve, many years later, snow fell heavier than usual. The town glowed warmly beneath it. Inside the community center, people gathered as they always had, some joyful, some tired, some simply needing to be somewhere that wasn't alone. A young volunteer stood near the door, nervous, unsure if she was doing it right. An older woman leaned toward her and whispered, "Just smile." "That's enough," the volunteer nodded. "Good." When the door opened again, letting in a stranger dusted with snow, she smiled and stepped aside. "Come in," she said gently. "You're welcome here." The stranger hesitated, then stepped inside. And so it continued. not as a tribute, not as a memory, but as a living thing. Could because what Arthur had given Willowmere was never meant to end with him. It was meant to move, quietly, patiently, could from one open door to the next. Town aged the way people do, softly, unevenly, with grace, earned through living. Some buildings were renovated, others stayed exactly as they were, their worn edges treated like history instead of flaws. Willowmere never chased newness for its own sake. Could it? Learned to ask a quieter question. Does this still serve the people who need it? That question guided everything. Good. The community center expanded once, adding a small room with wide windows facing the sea. It became a place for those who didn't want to talk. Could, who only needed to sit and let the world settle. No sign explained its purpose. It didn't need one. People understood. On certain evenings, when the wind carried the sound of waves farther inland, someone would bring out a guitar. Another would hum. No performances, no expectations, just sound-filling space that might otherwise have felt empty. Children who grew up in Willowmere didn't talk about it much when they left. They only noticed the difference years later, when other places felt sharper, faster, less forgiving. Many of them came back eventually. Not because they failed elsewhere, but because they remembered what it felt like to be seen without explanation. One autumn, a woman arrived with 2 small suitcases and a tired expression she tried to hide. She rented a room near the harbor. She didn't speak much at first. She watched more than she participated. No one pushed. Weeks passed. Then, months. One evening, she stayed late after a gathering, helping stack chairs she wasn't asked to touch. Someone thanked her. Someone asked her name. Someone listened. That was how it always began. Slowly, naturally, could, without ceremony. The bench by the harbor gained a second one beside it, not as a replacement, but as an offering. People sat facing the water, or each other, or nothing at all. Some stayed for minutes, some 4 hours. The sea never judged, neither did the town. And so the lesson continued, not written down, not announced, not taught outright. You don't have to arrive whole. You don't have to explain your silence. You don't have to hurry. You're healing. You just have to stay long enough for kindness to find you. Willowmere did not promise happiness. It offered something rarer. Room to breathe. The sea carried on, patient as ever, teaching the same lesson without words. Willowmere learned to listen to it. There were seasons when the town felt fuller, louder, brimming with life. And there were good seasons when it felt thin and quiet, like breath held between moments. No one tried to correct either. They understood that balance wasn't about keeping things the same. It was about allowing change without fear. On a misty morning, long after Arthur's name had faded from everyday conversation, a coot school teacher brought her class to the harbor. She asked the children to sit, just for a minute, and notice what they felt. Some said the wind was cold. Some said the water looked endless. One child said it felt like the town was listening back. The teacher smiled and said nothing. That afternoon, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Rain fell hard, then softened. People gathered indoors, sharing warmth and stories without planning to. When the storm passed, the air felt cleaner, lighter, like something old had been released. It often felt that way in Willowmere, not because problems didn't exist, but because they were carried together, quietly, without spectacle. Could years passed, faces changed, traditions shifted slightly, as all living things do. But the center held. Doors still opened. Silence was still respected. Time was still given. And when someone asked, usually late at night, usually when they were tired and unsure why, does this place feel different? The answer was never complicated. 'Cause here, you don't have to perform your worth. You don't have to rush. You're becoming. You don't have to be anything more than present. Willowmere didn't save people. It simply reminded them of something they already carried. And that was enough. And so, Willowmere never forgot him, not because his name was carved in stone, but because his kindness was carved into people. Every open door, every quiet welcome, every moment could. Someone chose to stay instead of walking away, carried his spirit forward. On Christmas nights, when the lights glow softly and the town gathers without knowing why, his legacy lives on. Good, reminding us that sometimes the greatest gift isn't found under a tree, but in the simple act of being there for one another. And in that way, Arthur never truly left. He became Christmas itself, warm, patient, and quietly everlasting.